A sniper needs steady hands. But Frank's right hand was crushed by the men who took everything from him. High atop a rusting water tower, bleeding and alone, this broken photographer prepares for one last assignment. He straps a high-tech weapon to the railing with a leather belt because he cannot even lift it. He looks through the scope, not to capture a memory, but to shatter an escape. Witness the breathtaking finale where a man must use a photographer's instinct to take one final impossible shot to stop a monster. This is the story of the last star. The midday sun beat down on the asphalt of the El Paso transit station, radiating a dry heat that made the air shimmer above the ground. Frank, a man of 40, with a face etched by the harsh winds of war zones and the deeper scars of invisible wounds, stepped off the Greyhound bus. He moved with a stiff, practiced caution, his eyes darting around the bustling crowd. It was a lingering habit from his days as a combat photographer, a constant vigilance that he could never quite switch off. He wore a faded field jacket despite the temperature, pulling it tight as if it were a shield against a world he found too loud and too unpredictable. He turned back to the open bus door and whistled softly. Buster, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a magnificent coat of silver and sable fur, emerged slowly from the shadows of the vehicle. The dog, usually an image of strength and alertness, hesitated at the top step. Buster whimpered low in his throat, favoring his hind leg where a sickness had taken root deep within his bones. Frank lifted the large animal gently, setting him on the pavement with a tenderness that contradicted his rugged, solitary appearance. In his right hand, Frank gripped the handle of a heavy, hard-shell black equipment case. Inside lay his last hope, a rare brass antique telescope from the late 19th century, the only thing of value he had left to sell to pay for the surgery Buster desperately needed. Suddenly, the high-pitched screech of tires tearing against concrete pierced the afternoon drone. Frank flinched violently, his shoulders hunching instinctively as the sound triggered a flash of memory from a distant desert. A runaway shuttle bus, its brakes having failed, plowed into the waiting area barrier just yards away. The collision sent a shockwave of panic through the crowd. Metal crumpled with a deafening groan, and a thick plume of acrid gray smoke billowed out, instantly choking the platform. Luggage carts overturned, sending suitcases sliding across the ground in a chaotic jumble. People screamed and shoved, desperate to escape the confusion. Frank dropped to his knees, his only thought for the coughing dog beside him. He needed to get Buster to clear air immediately. Covering his mouth with his sleeve, Frank groped blindly through the haze for his luggage handle. His fingers closed around the cold, textured grip of a black, hard case lying right beside his foot. He hauled Buster up, gripping the case tight, and navigated through the stampede toward the taxi stand. He shoved the case into the back of a waiting cab, helped his dog inside, and the vehicle sped away. Minutes later, the dust began to settle. A man named Kane stood amidst the wreckage, unmoving and eerily calm compared to the frantic travelers around him. Kane was a mercenary with cold, calculating eyes and the nondescript build of someone who specialized in blending in. He looked down at the remaining black case at his feet. He opened it just an inch, seeing the brass glint of a telescope. He snapped it shut. He did not yell. He did not chase after the taxi that was already fading into the city traffic. Instead, Kane pulled a sleek device from his pocket and tapped the screen. A red dot began to blink on the digital map, tracking the GPS signal of the military-grade case that Frank had unknowingly carried away. The bell above the door of the antique shop chimed softly as Frank pushed his way inside, the heavy black case gripping his hand like a lead weight. The shop was a narrow, dusty corridor of forgotten history, smelling of old paper and linseed oil. Behind the counter stood Mr. Henderson, a man in his late 60s with thin spectacles and the rigid posture of a retired Marine. Frank placed the case on the glass countertop with a thud. He tried to steady his breathing. He needed this transaction to go smoothly. If Henderson paid what the brass telescope was worth, Buster could have his surgery by the morning. Frank undid the latches. They clicked open with a precision that felt unfamiliar. He lifted the lid and froze. Instead of the warm, tarnished brass of his 19th-century heirloom, the case was lined with dark, high-density foam, cut with surgical precision. Nestled inside were disjointed components of matte black metal, cold and menacing. There was a barrel constructed from a strange composite material and a digital scope that looked more like a computer than a lens. Henderson leaned forward, squinting. His eyes widened behind his glasses. He looked from the case to Frank, his expression hardening instantly. He recognized military-grade technology when he saw it. Without a word, the old man's hand slid beneath the counter, his finger hovering over a silent alarm button. Frank slammed the lid shut, his heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed the handle and backed away, stumbling out of the shop just as Henderson reached for the telephone. Frank threw the case into the passenger seat of his rusted Ford pickup and jumped in beside Buster. The dog whined, sensing the spike in Frank's adrenaline. Frank fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. As the engine sputtered to life, a sleek black SUV screeched around the corner, blocking the narrow street ahead. Vargas's men had arrived. Frank threw the truck into reverse, the tires squealing against the pavement. He spun the wheel, mounting the curb to bypass the blockade. Another vehicle, this one driven by the mercenary Kane, idled at the far end of the block, watching like a predator, waiting for the prey to flush itself out. The chase was short and violent. Frank navigated the heavy pickup through the city streets, relying on reflexes honed in conflict zones. He swerved through traffic, but the black SUV was faster and heavier. It rammed the side of Frank's truck with a sickening crunch of metal. The force of the impact sent the pickup spinning out of control. It slammed into a concrete median with a bone-jarring halt. Frank was thrown against the door. A sharp tearing sensation ripped through his right shoulder, followed immediately by a wave of numbness that rendered his arm useless. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood. The driver's side door was jammed shut. Frank gasped, clutching his paralyzed arm. Beside him, Buster was barking urgently, a deep, rhythmic sound that cut through the ringing in Frank's ears. The dog pawed at the passenger door, signaling the way out. Painfully, Frank shoved the passenger door open with his good arm. He grabbed the handle of the cursed case, dragging it with him as he tumbled out onto the asphalt. Buster limped ahead, leading his injured master away from the wreckage and into the labyrinth of shadows in the nearby alleyways, just as heavy boots began to pound against the pavement behind them. Night had fallen over the border town, draping the narrow alleyways in suffocating darkness. Frank stumbled against the rough brick wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His right arm hung uselessly at his side, the shoulder throbbing with a white-hot pain that blurred his vision. Beside him, Buster collapsed onto the dirty pavement. The large German shepherd, his silver and sable coat, now matted with dust and grime, let out a soft, pained whimper. The dog could go no further. Frank looked up and saw a flickering fluorescent light above a modest storefront. The sign read simply, "Community Animal Rescue." He dragged himself to the door and pounded on the glass with his good hand. The sound echoed loudly in the empty street. Moments later, the lock turned and the door opened a crack. Lucia stood in the doorway. She was a woman of 32, with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot and eyes that held a mixture of exhaustion and deep, unyielding kindness. She wore scrubs that had seen too many long shifts. Seeing the disheveled, injured man, she instinctively moved to close the door, but then she saw Frank drop to his knees. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not threaten her. He simply pointed a trembling finger at the dog lying motionless on the concrete. "Please," Frank rasped, his voice cracking with desperation. "Just save him. I have no money, but I beg you." Lucia looked at the dog, then back at the man's pleading eyes. She opened the door wide. Inside the small, sterile examination room, Lucia worked quickly to stabilize Buster. She administered a painkiller and fluids, her hands moving with practiced grace. Frank sat in the corner, clutching his injured shoulder, watching her every move. "You are not from around here," Lucia said softly, checking Buster's heart rate. Frank shook his head. He gestured to the black case he had refused to leave behind. "I came to sell a telescope, an antique." A telescope? She asked, pausing. I used to take photographs, Frank murmured, his gaze distant. Of wars, of people hurting each other. After I came back, I did not want to look at this world anymore. I wanted to look at the stars. They are quiet. They are peaceful. Lucia looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She saw the haunted depth of his trauma. I understand, she said. I stay here, in this forgotten corner of the border, because animals do not lie, and they do not hate. I try to fix what people break. Suddenly, a low, vibrating rumble rose from the exam table. Buster, despite his sedation, lifted his head. His ears swiveled toward the front entrance. The fur along his spine stood on end, and a deep growl emanated from his chest. Frank stood up instantly, wincing as his shoulder flared. He knew that growl. It was the specific warning Buster used when a threat was imminent. He found us, Frank whispered. He moved toward the front door, intending to surrender himself to draw the danger away from the clinic. I have to go. I will not let them hurt you. Lucia grabbed his good arm, stopping him. Her grip was surprisingly strong. No, she whispered fiercely. If you go out there, they will kill you, and then they will kill your dog. She pointed to a narrow hallway at the back of the clinic. The emergency exit leads to the drainage canal. Go, now. Frank looked at her, overwhelmed by her courage. He nodded once, hoisted the heavy case with his left hand, and whistled for Buster. The dog struggled to his feet, fueled by loyalty, and followed his master into the shadows, leaving Lucia alone to face whatever was coming through the front door. Frank sat in the passenger seat of Lucia's compact sedan, the black case resting heavily on his lap. They were parked in the shadow of an overpass, the city lights flickering in the distance like distant embers. His good hand fumbled inside the lining of the case, fingers searching until they brushed against something hard and cold beneath the foam. He pulled out a small circular device, a tracking chip. A tiny red light pulsed on its surface, a silent heartbeat betraying their location to the men hunting them. A large refrigerated delivery truck rumbled past their hiding spot, its engine groaning under the weight of its cargo. Frank saw an opportunity. He rolled down the window and waited for the vehicle to slow for a turn. With a grunt of effort, he tossed the chip. It landed with a dull clatter into the open bed of the truck, hidden amongst crates of produce. The truck accelerated, carrying the signal away toward the highway, leading Kane and his men on a chase to nowhere. That bought us some time, Frank said, his voice raspy, but not much. Lucia drove them to her home, a small, modest house on the outskirts of the city where the desert scrub began to reclaim the pavement. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dried sage. For the first time in hours, the tension in Frank's chest loosened slightly. He knelt beside Buster, who had curled up on a rug near the heater. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady. Frank stroked the silver fur behind the dog's ears, his eyes softening. Lucia approached with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. She gently began to clean the dirt from Frank's face, her touch tentative but kind. "Why are you helping me?" Frank asked, looking at her. "You could have walked away." Lucia paused, her hand resting near his bruised cheek. "You came for the dog," she said simply. "Most people I meet here only care about money or power. You risked your life for a friend. That is worth saving." Frank looked around the quiet room. It felt like a life he had forgotten existed. "I am going to fix this," he promised, his voice low. "I will return this case. I will get my telescope back, or at least the money. And when I do, I am taking Buster north, away from this border. You should come. You and the dog. We could find a place where the stars are clear." A flicker of hope lit Lucia's tired eyes. She smiled, a small, fragile thing. "I would like that," she whispered. Miles away, in a dimly lit office overlooking the city, Vargas stood before a wall of monitors. He was a man who viewed people as assets or liabilities, nothing more. He watched the blinking dot on his screen move away from the city center, but he was not fooled. He turned to another screen, reviewing traffic camera footage from the street outside the veterinary clinic. He froze the image. It showed a license plate clearly. "She is the weak link," Vargas murmured, his voice devoid of emotion. He picked up his phone. "Forget the tracker. I know where the woman lives. Bring her to me." The meeting place was a graveyard of rusted steel on the edge of the desert. Towers of crushed automobiles loomed like jagged monoliths against the dying orange light of the setting sun. Frank walked into the clearing, his footsteps crunching on loose gravel and shattered glass. His right arm was strapped tight to his chest, useless and throbbing. In his left hand, he carried the black case. Vargas stood by a black SUV, flanked by 2 armed guards. Between them stood Lucia. Her hands were bound and her face was pale, but she held her head high. "I have what you want," Frank called out, his voice flat. "Let her go." Vargas nodded to one of his men, who walked forward and snatched the case from Frank's grip. The crime lord checked the contents quickly, a satisfied smirk curling his lip. He waved a dismissive hand. "Release her." The guard shoved Lucia forward roughly. She stumbled toward Frank, her eyes wide with relief. But as she bridged the distance between them, her gaze darted upward to a rusted crane overlooking the yard. A glint of sunlight reflected off a scope. Kane was there, waiting for the clean shot once the transaction was complete. Lucia stopped dead. She turned back to Frank, opening her mouth to scream a warning. "Frank, get down!" Before the words fully left her lips, the guard behind her, impatient and cruel, shoved her violently to keep her moving. The force of the push sent her sprawling sideways into a precarious stack of compacted sedans. The structure, already unstable, groaned under the sudden impact. A heavy steel transmission block, perched precariously at the top, shifted and plummeted. There was a sickening thud as the metal crushed the life beneath it. Frank froze. The world seemed to stop spinning. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, a high-pitched ringing exploded in his ears, drowning out the wind, the rustle of the desert, and his own heartbeat. It was the sound of the bomb blast from years ago, the sound of trauma returning to claim him. He fell to his knees, his eyes fixed on the stillness beneath the rubble. High above, Kane adjusted his aim. He squeezed the trigger. But just as the rifle fired, a gray streak launched from the shadows of a wrecked truck. Buster, having tracked his master across the scrubland, threw his 60 pounds of weight against the metal ladder of the crane where Kane was perched. The sudden vibration jarred the sniper's aim. The bullet hissed through the air, missing Frank's heart, and instead tearing a furrow through the flesh of his thigh. Frank collapsed, the pain indistinguishable from the agony in his soul. Buster landed on his bad leg and yelped, sliding down a pile of scrap, but he scrambled up again, placing himself between Frank and the gunman, baring his teeth in a snarl that promised violence. In the distance, the wail of police sirens began to rise, cutting through the heavy air. Someone had tipped them off. Vargas cursed, spitting on the ground. "We leave! Now!" He and his men scrambled into the SUV. Kane abandoned his perch, disappearing into the twilight. They left the black case sitting in the dust, too heavy to carry in a sprint, and fled before the law arrived. Frank was left alone in the encroaching dark, bleeding in the dirt, staring at the pile of steel that had become a tomb. Frank dragged his body up the rusted rungs of the old water tower, every movement a battle against the screaming nerves in his torn leg and paralyzed shoulder. Below him, the desert stretched out like a bruised canvas, dark and indifferent. Far down the lone highway, a cloud of dust marked the retreat of the armored SUV carrying Vargas and his mercenary executioner. They were escaping, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than death. He reached the metal platform and collapsed for a moment, gasping for air. Buster, his faithful German shepherd, waited at the base of the tower, guarding the ladder despite his own limp. Frank pulled the black case toward him. He opened it with his left hand, his movements deliberate and cold. He assembled the device inside, a high-velocity kinetic rifle designed to stop engines, not just hearts. He tried to lift it, but his right arm hung dead at his side. He could not steady the weight. Frank gritted his teeth. He unbuckled his leather belt and used it to lash the barrel of the weapon firmly to the iron railing of the tower. He wedged the stock against his left shoulder, contorting his body to align his eye with the digital scope. It was awkward and painful, but it held. He looked through the lens. The digital display illuminated the retreating vehicle in stark green and white lines. He was no longer a soldier. He was a photographer composing a frame. He did not aim for the men inside. He aimed for the front axle of the machine that carried them. He adjusted for the wind sweeping across the plains. He waited, regulating his breathing just as he had done 1,000 times before, capturing a moment of tragedy on film. One breath, two. Frank squeezed the trigger. A singular whip-crack sound split the air, sharper and louder than thunder. A mile away, the front right wheel of the speeding SUV obliterated. The vehicle dipped violently, the metal rim digging into the asphalt. It flipped, rolling end over end in a chaotic spray of sparks and debris before coming to rest upside down in a ditch, smoke pouring from its crushed chassis. The sirens in the distance grew louder, closing in on the trapped criminals. Frank did not watch the arrest. He dismantled the rifle, leaving the pieces scattered on the platform, and began the long, painful descent. 3 weeks later, the evening sky over the cemetery was a tapestry of deep velvet and silver light. Frank sat on the grass beside a fresh mound of earth. Beside him sat Buster. The dog had a shaved patch on his flank and a fresh surgical scar, but his eyes were bright and he sat tall, the sickness finally cut from his body. Frank had sold his truck to pay the bill. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the dog at his side. He looked down at the simple wooden cross bearing Lucia's name. "We are going north," Frank whispered to the silence. "Just like we planned." He looked up at the vast, glittering expanse of the Milky Way above them. Slowly, instinctively, Frank raised his hands. His left hand formed a frame, and his right hand curled, as if holding a camera body, his index finger hovering over an invisible shutter button. He closed one eye, focusing on a particularly bright star burning in the darkness. He clicked the imaginary shutter, capturing the beauty and the peace forever in his memory. Frank put down his camera to take action, proving that heroes are defined not by what they observe, but by what they are willing to sacrifice. May we all find the strength to defend what matters most when the time comes. If you enjoyed this narrative, please welcome yourself into our family by subscribing and sharing this video. Tell us your feelings in the comments below, and do not let the adventure end here. Click the new video on your screen to discover what happens next.